Now, the next general election, it's due to take place on May the 2nd, 2024. Mark your diaries. But following the budget, there has been speculation that it might come a little bit sooner than that, maybe even before the rise in corporation tax is due to take hold in 2023. The only way, of course, that can happen with certainty is if the government does away with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, introduced by the coalition government in 2011. That act took away the power of the Prime Minister to choose the date of the general election and instead fixed it by law every 5 years. It hasn't been universally popular, to say the least, and now it's on the government wish list for repeal. Our reporter Jack Fenwick's been exploring why it's proved so controversial and what might replace it.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill has a single clear purpose: to introduce fixed-term parliaments to the United Kingdom, to remove the right of a Prime Minister to seek a dissolution of Parliament for pure political gain.
That's then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, extolling the virtues of the new fixed-term Parliaments bill to the House of Commons in September 2010.
Because for the first time in our history, the timing of general elections will not be a plaything of governments.
Nick Clegg's Liberal Democrats had just entered into coalition with the Conservatives and were worried that David Cameron might spring an early election on them if the timing suited him.
My name's Polly Mackenzie and I'm the Chief Executive of a think tank, Demos. In 2010, I worked for Nick Clegg and helped to write the coalition agreement, which agreed we would create a Fixed-Term Parliament Act. The Fixed-Term Parliament Act was designed to create a commitment between the two political parties who were forming a coalition that they would stick it out for the full 5 years, to make it just a little bit more difficult for the main party, the Conservatives, to just sort of do the dirty on the smaller party.
And in that sense, the Act was a success. Despite what many predicted, the coalition government lasted for a full 5-year term. But some of those in favour of fixed-term parliaments hoped it would signal the start of something much bigger. Polly Mackenzie again.
So at the time the coalition was formed, David Cameron had made a big, open and generous offer about a different kind of government and was being incredibly adaptable and flexible and seemed to want to be a different kind of Prime Minister. And we did have a series of proposals for constitutional reform, and the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act was just the first. We planned to reform the House of Lords, introduce elections to the House of Lords. And then, of course, we had agreed as a core part of the coalition that there would be a referendum on whether we should change our voting system for one that was a bit more proportional. So it was part of a wider constitutional reform plan, but it was, in the end, the only bit that actually went anywhere.
So the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act remained as the first stage in a hoped-for series of legislation that never came to be. Even so, there were still underlying issues with the reform.
My name is Professor Meg Russell. I'm Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London, or UCL. The legislation was rather rushed, and it was quite controversial at the time, and it was very substantially changed in Parliament. The government took out a whole chunk of the bill while it was in the Lords and replaced it with wholly new measures, which therefore didn't have full time for scrutiny. And I think that may be where some of the problems come from.
While the Act helped the coalition government to stay together for a full term, once the Lib Dems had exited government, it didn't exactly do what it said on the tin. Much to the disdain of Brenda from Bristol, the 2015 election was swiftly followed by another in 2017.
You're joking. Not another one?
And then another 2 years later.
Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority when all the votes are counted after this election of December 2019.
Professor Meg Russell again.
I think that the central thing that the bill did is not well reflected in the name. So it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act in the first place. It never actually fixed terms. It always included provisions for there to be early elections. And that's what Theresa May used in 2017. It said that if she could get a 2/3 majority in the House of Commons for there to be an early election, there would be an early election, and that happened all perfectly smoothly.
It was in the slow, tumultuous run-up to the 2019 election, when Brexit tensions dominated UK politics, that the Act's critics became louder. Remember this?
Mr. Speaker, it is completely impossible for government to function if the House of Commons refuses to pass anything that the government proposes. And in my view, and the view of this government, there must now be an election.
The offer of the election today is a bit like the offer of an apple to Snow White and the Wicked Queen, because What he's offering is not an apple or even an election, but the poison of a no deal.
3 times Boris Johnson asked MPs to back an early election using the provisions of the Act. 3 times MPs refused to comply. And some placed the blame for that uncertainty directly at the feet of the coalition government's legislation.
I would just like to say 3 things which I hope the House will take on board.
Here's now former Conservative MP Alan Duncan, speaking during a tense late-night Commons debate in September 2019.
And the effect of this Act is now to trammel this government and our Prime Minister in a very, very Kafkaesque trap, that he's finding it very difficult to govern, but is unable to call a general election. And I very much hope that the first act, probably of the next Parliament, will be to abolish the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act.
Former Lib Dem advisor Polly Mackenzie says the Act wasn't to blame.
So the briefing against the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act was really briefing against frustration that the Prime Minister couldn't do what the Prime Minister thought would be best for him. And of course, people around the Prime Minister are going to be upset when the Prime Minister doesn't have the power to do what he wants. But that was, in fact, the point of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, to take power away from the Prime Minister and put it into the hands of Parliament.
Of course, Boris Johnson did eventually get his election, and both major parties pledged to repeal the Act. The Conservatives said it led to paralysis at a time the country needed decisive action. Labour said it stifled democracy and propped up weak governments. A cross-party committee of parliamentarians is now reviewing the government's draft bill to replace the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, but Professor Meg Russell says the debate is far from over.
They're trying to recreate a prerogative power, which is something that lawyers question whether that's even possible. So I think that the committee may recommend a simpler solution. And of course, it's quite difficult for a government to propose removing powers from Parliament that Parliament's already got. So I think that it is possible that we might see recommendations that some of the stuff in the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act should go, but what you could have is a bill where by simple majority the House of Commons support is required to endorse an early general election. And I think that could be a compromise point which would give the government most of what it wants and also remove some of the aspects of the draft bill that people think are problematic.
That's Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit at University College London, ending that report by Jack Fenwick. And Mark, as Constitution Minister from 2010 to 2012, the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, it was your baby. You introduced that bill. The legislation, I assume you felt had enough safeguards, allowing an election if 2/3 of Parliament agreed. And we saw that happen in 2017 and eventually in December 2019. So do you think the government should repeal it?
Well, I do for this reason. I think, as your report made it clear, it was a success in the 2010 to 2015 period, making sure that government ran its full term. But of course, you can't always foresee every eventuality. And I think there was a general view in the public in 2019 that the position we were in, where the government couldn't govern, but also couldn't go to the public to get the public to make a choice, was not satisfactory. And I think you have to reflect some of that reality in updating the legislation. So I welcome the fact that the legislation is going to be changed. And obviously we're consulting, as was said, there's parliamentary scrutiny going on at the moment to see the best way of doing that. And I think we can end up with a better position that means we won't be ever trapped in that position again that we were in 2019, which I think almost everyone thinks was deeply unsatisfactory, including the public.
Philip, Alan Duncan said there it's a Kafkaesque trap. You ran Nick Clegg's Deputy Prime Ministerial office during the coalition. Did you have concerns about the Fixed-Term Parliament Act at the time when you were working in the Cabinet Office?
Certainly not about the principle of it. It is about, as it was said in this, Nick said in the clip, it is about giving power back to Parliament, and I think that principle should remain. This is about respecting the democratic process. But as the clip also made clear, there was a whole bunch of other things that we were seeking to do, which all fell by the wayside. I worked actually with Mark on the House of Lords reform, which was, of course, was killed off by backbench opposition from the Conservative Party. and by tactical plays by the Labour Party, but also party funding and the electoral system. There was the referendum on alternative votes. All of this stuff is really important. Everybody says, oh, it's not a priority. Nobody thinks or worries about this sort of thing. But politicians should be concerned about our democratic infrastructure, and it is seriously eroded in this country. The House of Lords is a democratic outrage, one instance. And it is really important that politicians think through how they sustain and renew our democratic processes. And the Fixed Term Parliament Act, I think, should still be part of that, but along with wider reforms to restore trust in our democracy.
Well, you clearly still feel quite passionate about it. Let me ask Sarah then, because Labour has also pledged to repeal the Act. Is that still your party's stance? I mean, given the fact that you could argue it worked because of the safeguards that were in it before.
Yeah, I think we did say we wanted to get rid of it, and the Joint Committee on the Fixed Term Parliament Act is looking at this. But look, here's the challenge. So we agree in principle, but there's a real danger, I think, of giving unfettered power to the Prime Minister. We know that there's a huge advantage as to when you call an election, but the old system, if we went just back to the old system, that relies on a kind of gentleman's convention, people behaving well, the Prime Minister not putting the Queen in a difficult position. But I don't think we have a gentleman in government at the moment. They ignore all the other parliamentary conventions. You know, only 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister misled Parliament on COVID contracts. You know, I think what we need, if we're going to repeal it, is to have some legislation that says things like, OK, after an election, the Prime Minister has a set period of time when he has to bring Parliament back. As they do in America. We need more checks and balances to stop that unfettered power, because it is pretty significant.
Mark, a 10-second response from you.
Well, I think I'm happy to look at what the parliamentary scrutiny is. I'm perfectly happy to go back to the system that we had. The ultimate check on the Prime Minister's power is the voters. And if Prime Ministers abuse the power, voters tend to wreak their revenge.
OK, thank you. That was your 10 seconds. Thanks a lot. Now, tomorrow is International Women's Day and Commonwealth Day, and the